Everyone. We'll now probably get started, and a warm welcome to each one of you who took the time out to come and engage and participate in this second virtual session that the Center for New Economic Studies has planned for a period of a few weeks, actually. The idea was to encourage discussion on subjects that are seen as more pressing at a time when, perhaps, there are times where you see that there are events that happen in a matter of few weeks that you discuss for decades. And then there are decades that you have where you just don't have, information that you tend to deliberate much out for a longer period of time. I think with the COVID pandemic and the kind of socio-political and socio-economic situations that have emerged across from countries, everywhere you will find that there has been this issue that a few nations particularly have been in, whether it's the United States, whether it's India, back in South Asia, whether it's the evolving situation at the border area right now between India and China, whether it is the situation back in Hong Kong, or whether there is a situation back in South America and the Caribbean. So we have someone from the Caribbean today to talk a little bit about the nature of events that are happening there. So I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about the context in which this particular session was planned. I had written a column I would say probably last week at the time when when the thought around this panel discussion was being deliberated upon, and we were getting in touch with respective panelists. So I want to read a short note before we get started so that you have, particularly the audience has an idea about what is that we are really looking at. Because the session is called On the Meaning of Social Justice in a Polarized Political Landscape. So let me bring everyone to be aware of what we're discussing today. All right, so let me read this short note. Last few weeks saw a massive explosion of protests across streets of the United States, expressing anger, discontentment, in some cases by violent means, against acts of institutional racism witnessed against the African-American community after deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, amongst many others. Protests spill over to different parts of the world in countries like United Kingdom, France, etc., resulting even in the toppling of statues of the personified and, quote, I quote, glorified colonialists accused of being racist against the Black community during their lives. In India, too, months before the pandemic struck, similar mass movements were seen condemning the subjugation of minorities seen during the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Registration of Citizenship acts. There are three common linkages between the nature of protest movements that are being seen across the world today. A, they're largely peaceful in nature, which is involving a much wider representation of people across social aggregates of class, caste, ethnicity, race, and gender. B, these, in a lot of cases, have predominantly been led by women, at least for the larger part of the CAA protests seen in India. We saw that how women across classes, different groups had spearheaded these movements. C, all appeal to be restoring and making a plea for social justice. I would like to focus on the third linkage here, and that is what this panel is going to do, especially in relation to what the idea of social justice means in a deeply polarized socio-political and socio-economic landscape today. Often, there is a tendency, at least amongst the general citizenry, to obscure the meaning of social justice for retaliation, resentment against any form of indignation seen, received or by an individual or a section of citizens or even a social group. Institutional processes are systematically questioned for their own propriety or failure to deliver justice, even when indignation is circumstantially proven. The angst against the police in India during the CAA protests, against the criminal justice system in the US, and even in the rest of the world, have all reflected this institutional failure in ensuring citizens to feel safe, protected for, and in ensuring what you call a just social arrangement. However, to dispose the meaning of social justice simply from the perspective of institutional means and due processes, as important as they are, makes the actual meaning of what justice means in a far more limited sense. Adam Smith, often hailed as the father of classical economics and recognized for his work on the invisible hand in The Wealth of Nations, wrote extensively about on how social psychology, from a virtue ethics-based reflective system, should guide both individual and collective action as against reason alone. The transformative ideas on explaining the meaning of social justice in Theory of Moral Sentiments, a text which was written way before The Wealth of Nations, provides an extension of views expressed by other Scottish Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume around the time, and offers an interesting inflection point today for both closer self and collective reflection. Adam Smith saw justice to be realized as a social virtue and as a function of the level of beneficence present in collective propriety of individuals, of a society, or a nation. He was cautious to point out that the meaning of justice mustn't be confused with finding a means to actualize our resentment. As Smith says, and I quote, "Nature gave us resentment for our own defense and only for that," end of quote. Justice, according to Smith, must be seen as a virtue of its own. I quote Smith again, "the observance of which is not left to the freedom of our own wills, which, if resorted by force and violated by due process, can expose one or many or two agents of further resentment and injustice." I finished end of quote. In simpler terms, social justice requires a cultivated ecosystem of collective conduct, of beneficence, shared empathy, and other virtues in both self and collective propriety in shaping and complementing a rules-based order, a kind of which was very important to moral political philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Jeremy Bentham. Nyaya, the word that we use in Hindi for justice, doesn't just lie in niti or policy or institutional due processes alone, but in an accumulative shared experience from the society's virtues and ethics when practiced in propriety. This can be said for determining the nature and form of social relations between white and black Americans, Hindus and Muslims, between, let's say, the Indo-Guyanese and the Afro-Guyanese, or between any other social aggregate of class, caste, ethnicity, race, and gender. With that, let me ask to introduce the nature of questions that we've come together for today. I mean, the write-up was slightly longer, but I wanted to just introduce the context before we get into the meat of our discussion. All right. So for the audience, I just wanted to show, and I think everyone now can see the screen where we have a PowerPoint just to give us a certain perspective on the questions that we've assigned to each of the panelists today. Each of the questions are largely shaped as focal points for the panelists to talk about based on their own work, their own scholarship, and also we'll see basically how it goes from there. So for Professor Michael Davis, we had a question in context to the recent instances of police brutality being seen in multiple cases of African Americans across the US, and basically trying to understand from his own life and his own work as a public intellectual, covering, understanding, being part of the democratization movement in Hong Kong and getting access to basic human rights to assembly and expression, to what extent there is a need to revisit a collective understanding of what social justice means, and what institutional measures can allow us to progressively realize a more just social arrangement. We'll then move to Professor Vesselin Popovski to be able to understand, and I think this is a very important question for all of us to be able to look at, largely from a perspective of international humanitarian law and international law as well. In a rapidly deglobalizing world witnessing a gradual regression in collective respect for moral principles and ethics in international politics, what moral and ethical processes, say institutionally or non-institutional, can help reorient or transcendently imagine a new international order that can entrust a greater spirit of mutual cooperation and enactment of collective virtues. I'll move on just to give a perspective on what Professor Ambreen Aga and Professor Sweta Sen here today would be discussing in terms of trying to develop a more gendered approach for studying and understanding the case for social justice. We look forward to their remarks on this context. I'm just not reading the questions out line by line to just save on time. Professor Preetham, who I think most of you would know has been closely looking and working on aspirants around constitutional law and the subject of dignity, in fact, in constitutional law as well, to be asked this question on the responsibility and the role of the Supreme Court as seen in the last year and a half particularly, and how does one understand the kind of regression we are seeing in terms of the, to a certain extent, the inability of the Supreme Court to safeguard basic civic freedoms for all Indian citizens. And is it the time that we're seeing that is a new majoritarian social contract that is emerging and being represented from? We also have with us a person and a dear friend, Mr. Dhanraj Singh from the Caribbean. He's based out in the US right now, but he has been very closely monitoring a series of events that have been happening in one of the most important nations in the Caribbean, that is Guyana, a place that we work closely with in terms of issues around budget and policy centrics. But he's been trying to understand the kind of concern that has been raised as part of a larger political happening of a democratic regression and the respect and regard for electoral processes and the right of citizens to vote. So with that, let me ask Professor Davis to go in first, and please share his views and remarks.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Good. Thank you, Deepanshu. I really appreciate your organizing these. I once was able to attend this event in person and when your series of talks, and very much appreciated it. And we were supposed to schedule me in person to do it again, except the pandemic got in the way. So I appreciate that we finally get to do this. I'm very early in the morning here in the US, but feel like I'm in India, at least for a few minutes, and I enjoy that. What I want to do is, I think my contribution will be extremely modest because I'm not a philosopher, but kind of more of a social activist. So as a scholar, that sort of shapes my work. But I want to talk a bit about what I call the power and challenge of social activism. What does it matter? Okay, in my view, the need to understand individual justice is in the social context is what we want to pay attention to. And does social justice depend on social movements? Because when we talk about social justice, I think we're talking about more about not just an individual getting justice, but a group of some kind of identified group in a social context. And so I would argue that we the people, the presence of we the people is important. And so in that vein, I think the first step is to understand the role of protest and social movements in orchestrating change, okay? So you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. I was involved in Hong Kong in the protest over many years, looking at in a sense, a large collective society's demands. As you may know, I also work on the Tibet issue. And the Tibetans, of course, are now 70-some years into a kind of social movement to try to gain justice. It's a rather discouraging project because they don't seem quite to get it even yet. And even as a young lawyer, I worked for indigenous people's rights. So I've seen a lot of this in a very collective way, the people are trying to get justice. And so they go to the street. And unfortunately, I think protests often become the target instead of the social ill. And this is one of the things I find disturbing recently, is that regimes, both democratic and authoritarian, will tend to target the group. And in India, I think the same thing happens with this Citizens Amendment Act and minority groups protesting. There's an attempt to turn them into the bad guy. And then the way that's done is the police are unleashed on the group. So instead of addressing the problem that people are protesting about and responding to the demands that they're making, popular protest becomes sort of a legal problem. It's turned over to the police, who are told to maintain law and order. And then a big debate about protest violence ensues, okay? And this accusations of violence are used to dismiss, what the people are demanding. In effect, it sidesteps. So we know in the case in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement, that people were basically demanding basic rights. And yet, when it finally takes shape in the protest, Trump is responding that when the rioting starts, the shooting starts. So you get this kind of invocation of police. In my experience in Hong Kong, a similar kind of thing happened, that the people were demanding basically compliance with commitments that China made to Hong Kong. We're talking about one of the most amazing societies, well-developed societies in the world, a kind of New York or London of East Asia, and it's being put under a regime that's a kind of hardline regime. And in order to do this and preserve what the society had, promises were made about the autonomy of the region. And the notions of autonomy, of course, come up all around the world. And we know in India and Kashmir, recently they're trying to diminish autonomy. So that people are trying to save their own society. And instead of responding to the problem, you get the police sent in to quell the problem. And of course, the police are never given the power to answer the political demands. In Hong Kong, there were 5 political demands, but the police cannot grant any of them. And so the people take to the street and they protest in 1 million man march and 1 million person march, excuse me, and then 2 million a week later, and no response from the government occurs. And then they invade the legislative body in Hong Kong, and a very telling poster is put up in that legislative body on the wall. When the legislative chamber is cleared, there is this sign says, "You taught us nonviolence does not work." So that if we protest quietly, nonviolently, we get nothing. And so this is an interesting problem. And so people are having a kind of taking to the streets, and there's rock throwing, and the police are beating people up. And here in the US, it was stunning that exactly the same thing happened several months later, when after police already had abused their power and by excessive force, then when the protest occurs, police are called in. And so now there's a movement to disband the police, that the people think, well, the police just have a culture that's irredeemable. We can't solve it. So social justice, violence, and police become entangled in this web of dispute. And so this raises very serious questions. When is civil disobedience justified? When is pushing back against the police justified? When the police are throwing people down escalators and beating them up, or beating them with clubs, or putting their, ramming their heads into the pavement, is a violent response appropriate? So I just did a report on this in the Hong Kong case and interviewed about 50 social activists on the street. And it was interesting because I personally have long advocated nonviolence as approach, because I believe that violent social movements often produce governments in the end that are just as bad as the one they're replacing. So and there's a lot of work done on this. Chenoweth and others have written on this. So I believe in nonviolence, but then we're looking at this situation, and the youngsters are hotheads a bit, and they're throwing rocks and picking stones out of the pavement of the street and throwing it at the police and so on. And then I talk to my many years friends I have who are in the social movement there, and ask them, you know, well, do you condemn the violence? And they're hesitant to condemn the violence, because if they start condemning it, they create divisions within the movement. And one of them, a guy named Benny Tai, who was my colleague at the University of Hong Kong in the law faculty, he says, I have to stand for nonviolence, and I have stood for nonviolence. He was even conducting classes on nonviolence in the lead up to the 2014 protest. And so I believe in that. But does that mean I have to condemn violence, you know, by my colleagues in the movement? Isn't that my choice, my moral choice, whether I condemn violence or not? And I thought that was an interesting answer, because in these movements, this is always the case, that the regime wants, the government, whatever it may be, wants to divide the movement, and it uses police force against them, and then wants the different factions of the movement to be in disarray and attacking each other. And this becomes a way that the social movement to achieve social justice achieves nothing. And so how do we, as scholars and thinkers and public intellectuals, respond to this? Well, we advocate nonviolence. I think we do that. But there is a question whether we have to condemn those people who felt violence was necessary or not. And I don't know if we have an answer. But I found in the middle of this movement, people were asking this question. And I thought it's an important question, because the social movements I've seen almost always involve police violence. And so what is the response? I mean, even if you look at the Palestinian, the youth throwing rocks, and the Israeli occupying forces armed to the teeth, just what is an appropriate way for a group to respond to this kind of force in society? And what kinds of questions, when we talk about social justice and social movements, should we be asking about police and training and the role of police in general? Is this movement to disband police departments going to spread? And how should we respond to it? Well, I think I've said enough, but this is just to hopefully lay some social context for social justice. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. And I think that sets the tone up for getting us to ask Professor Vesselin, because this is a question that I often come across. And I was recently hearing this very, I would strongly recommend to students, a recent podcast from Professor Joseph Nye on his recent book, which is trying to trace the moral decisions and dilemmas of US presidents right from the early 1960s. And he looks very closely at this question of how moral, quote unquote, are actions seen of presidents and consequences. And he gets very closely into this issue around that in international politics, there is this completely different interpretation around the idea of morality, and how it has this double-edged sword on every action being seen from the means and from the consequences of this action being judged from a totally moral perspective. But how that meaning has, or the evolution of that concept of morality has also seen a huge transformation, particularly under Donald Trump. So with that, Professor Vesselin, can I ask you to please come in, and please feel free to
take
remarks and other questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dipanshu, and it is an excellent range of topics. And I would like also to respond to a few of the questions which Michael Davis raised. But let me first address the bigger kind of historical problem we are in. As you ask in your question, where do we stand, and how can we change the tendencies of populism, nationalism, xenophobia, and to move back to a respect to human rights? And I was thinking, historically, if we think of, let's say, 1933 and 1953, 20 years difference, obviously the world in 1913, before the First World War, looks pretty nice. There were developments and many places around the world at the time, mostly Europe, I will say, looked pretty much safe. There were books written at the time projecting the bright future. And only a year later, in 1914, we have the First World War with all the disasters and the communist revolution in Russia, another big type of destroying a society which was very historical. And then we came to the Nazi regime, to the fascist movement in Italy in 1930. So the world in 1933 was very dark, was very pessimistic, with the future invasion of Italy into Abyssinia and Nazi Germany into Austria and Czechoslovakia, the Second World War. And then if we compare that to 1953, we will see a big difference again in a positive sense, because in 1953 we had already the Marshall Plan, the recovery of Europe, later the acceptance of Germany into the United Nations and so on. So if we compare that with where we stand now, again, a similar story, you may say. 1990, 30 years ago, we had the end of communism. A lot of people were saying this is the end of history. The future of the world is a liberal democracy and market economy and nothing worse than that. And we are in a new world order with Soviet Union and then Russia at the time cooperating for disarmament. Remember, Gorbachev proposed to reduce the nuclear weapon. So there was a very positive moment in the 1990s. And then the question comes, why today in 2020, we are back into a terrible time with Brexit, with the election of Donald Trump, with xenophobia all around the world. Migrants are blamed for crimes they never commit. And so again, my still feeling is that this is a dark time, which is terrible for human rights, for rule of law, but that's not, so to speak, unusual. We will get back to all the issues at some point. So, but social movement is important. So that's what I fully agree with Michael Davis. Without the daily effort, human rights will not be respected. Forget it. You need to fight for human rights daily. Otherwise, again, my experience in Eastern Europe is quite interesting. Back in 1989, where I was a young student, I protested against the communism, and we faced exactly the dilemma which Michael suggests. To what extent you can be non-violent or violent? Again, among us, there were vandals. There were people who will break a window and steal some jewelry, and it is part of a peaceful, otherwise, protest. So one thing to remember is always to divide the two. Don't mix the vandals with the protesters. The problem is the media reporting only and predominantly on the violence, on the looting, on the burning of a house over a car, because that is more media attractive. Nobody will report for hours peaceful people marching and demanding peacefully a change, a reform, which is to be admired and to be supported. But if one of those thousands protesters is actually not a protester, he is a criminal, but he uses the chaos to vandalize a shop and to steal the jewelry, the media will go there and will report that. And if you only watch the news, you will think that the protesters are violent. They are not. 1 out of 1,000 will be violent, but that will be not a protester, because that vandal will lose any chaos. If it is a natural disaster and the shop is destroyed, he will go and steal the jewelry. If there is an electricity blackout, that vandal will use the chaos to go and to loot. Protesters and looters are two separate groups. The protesters are thousands, the vandals are individuals. And never please mix the two. They have absolutely nothing in common. Even if the media can report the vandals much more than the protesters. So that's my first kind of message to separate the two. The second is, and Dipanshu mentioned the monuments. And I was thinking that I used to live in London, and in London you have 90% of the monuments are imperial time monuments. These are generals or soldiers or some leaders at the time. And all they did is to sustain the British Empire. And these are ugly statues. They're horrible. They're not necessary. They need to be toppled down. There is no purpose to have Nelson on Trafalgar Square apart from to be toppled down. Actually, I will say the purpose of the statue is to be toppled down. There is no other purpose of this ugly statue there. They are high, nobody even knows them. If you ask any person on the street to name few of those generals, they will not be able to tell you. They have no even symbolic value. They're as useless as stones to be toppled down. Again, I talked to my daughter yesterday, and she really is quite a revolutionary person, and she went to the Black Lives Matter movement, and she was the one basically throwing dirt on Churchill. And I said, but are you really evaluating Churchill as somebody? And she said, absolutely, he's useless. Churchill's statue is not Churchill as a historical figure in a museum. You can study about Churchill, but as an ugly statue in front of the Westminster is absolutely useless. They have to remove it. And at some point they will remove it because they will realize how useless is Nelson and Churchill. In fact, if you read the book by Afua Hirsch, British, she basically suggests that a lot of the minorities and the Africans and the Indians in England, they don't really feel British because the British history is very much the imperial and the colonial history. And people have difficulties to identify them as British. And once she was in a tourist double-decker bus and she took the microphone, the driver allowed her. And when they passed around the Nelson column or the Churchill monument, she said exactly what those people were. Many tourists didn't know that. And she later explained that, in fact, this is very much how people feel about Nelson. And an old lady approached her and said, but look, Nelson, we respect Nelson. He fought a lot of battles. He was a successful admiral. And because she was a Black African, and he said, what if we come to your country and destroy your monument? And Afua replied, oh, but that's exactly what Nelson did. Nelson came to our country and destroyed all the monuments. So what you're telling me is exactly what Nelson did to our country in Africa. So why do we need the Nelson there? We should remove it. Why do we need Churchill there? We should remove it. So don't worry to topple monuments. Actually, to be honest, we topple all the monuments in Bulgaria. And we didn't ask the permission of a mayor, we didn't make a lobby or petition or collect. We simply sent somebody there during the night time and removed it. Removing monuments is absolutely, I will call it a non-violence. You don't kill anybody. You simply remove a hated symbol. And there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, they should be removed. You know, the Confederate generals in America were not put there because of the Civil War. They are put much, much later. And the only purpose of those Confederate generals is to intimidate the Black African population. Nothing else. There is no symbol. They are not heroes. They are villains. And they are there to remind the minority that they are minority. Why do you need them? Absolutely unnecessary. So I fully support the idea that sometimes if the movement doesn't become angry and violent, it is not noticed. The silent majority society will not notice it unless it becomes violent. And when in Bulgaria in 1989, they burned the Communist Party headquarters, some people accused that and said, oh, well, we shouldn't do that. We should be non-violent. We shouldn't burn houses. Although my position was, if you don't burn the Communist Party headquarters, nobody will notice it. So you need to send a message strongly, and that's the way to do it. We need to fight daily. It's not easy. It takes time. But the only way to do it is to continue. And I agree. It's a dark moment for human rights. It's a dark moment for rule of law. Hopefully the elections in November in the United States will change the current nationalism and populism. Because otherwise, the problem with an administration of Donald Trump is that actually it affects all the other dictators who have a green card to do whatever they want. It's not only the Americans who suffer here, but also everybody in Turkey, in Philippines, in Russia, because the dictators very easily support each other. And that's the problem, because you have an excuse to violate human rights in Saudi Arabia, everywhere, by referring to what the United States does today. I'm happy to take questions later, but something which I kind of, why I'm optimistic, a book I've just read, and this is a very recent one, is called Humankind, A Hopeful History by a Dutch historian called Rutger Bregman. And he, in fact, a man that in every situation, we look at the bad news. And the bad news is 1%. 99% of the news is good, but we don't look at that because we watch media, we watch news, and the news is only negative. But if we look at the other side, he brings a lot of statistics, but one which was quite interesting one, is that to commit a crime, to kill somebody is not easy. It's actually not many people do that. It's 1 out of thousands. Even soldiers, and he brings that statistics, I didn't know that in the time of war, the enemy combatant, your duty is to kill an enemy combatant, but not many soldiers do that. And he said the percentage of soldiers who actually kill somebody from the other army is about 35%. The 65% of the soldiers do something else. They bring munitions, they have different tasks in the army. And they also, even those 35 who will kill an enemy soldier will do it from distance. They will probably throw a grenade. But personally, to use a knife to kill somebody or a bayonet is a very small percentage, exactly because it's so morally difficult to do it. And here comes my kind of curiosity. I hope the other panelists may address that. The clash between India and China a couple of days ago was quite interesting, exactly because they didn't use weapons. They kill each other virtually by hands. Although they are soldiers, they probably could have weapons. And that's quite unusual. And for me, it's still a kind of a mystery. But the reaction of India and China was very interesting in itself. They blame each other almost like little children, saying, oh, you did it first. No, you did it first. Oh, apologize. No, you apologize. So the two titans, the two giants, India and China, which we hope to one day will be the biggest global leaders in the world, in that incident, acted very much like small children, blaming each other who did it first. And also, which is even more worrisome, is that they, in fact, produce casualties, and these casualties were virtually kind of inflicted, not by throwing a grenade far away, but virtually grabbing someone and throwing someone out of the cliff or whatever. I don't know much details, but for me, this is quite an interesting moment, and it deserves a lot of analysis. And again, I don't have the time and the knowledge yet, but for me, it will be a very interesting moment to analyze. That's for the moment what I wanted to say, Dipanshu. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Vesselin. So let me ask, actually, and this would be interesting because we're talking about different variants and understandings of what social justice means in the sense of different schemes and for whom, right? There are protesters, there are looters, there are those who are in the silent majority who are trying to fight on issues. There was this amazing article I was recently reading in the Project Syndicate, which is talking about people's power and the need for grassroots level mobilizations, which cannot substitute for social media based, activism, which seems to have almost replaced this understanding that rule of law can be, reinstated just by pointing out the fallacies or concerns with a given act or a law, and creating, let's say, hashtag movements or hashtag, contexts. There will be enough voice that's created just by the sheer numbers for a change to come. And that cannot happen unless and until you're willing to be the patient one, be willing to engage with the state, and in state rule of law, even though the very same institutions, that is the courts, the police, are being seen as the perpetrators or those, let's say, in other words, as Professor Davis pointed out, committing acts where social movements are often being seen as synonymous with police brutality. But these are the same set of institutions that you have to convince, in other ways, to uphold the rule of law. With that, let me ask Professor Preetham to actually come in at this point of time, because a lot of questions have been asked in recent months, and I think of some like 2 or 3 excellent columns that Professor Pratapbhanu Mehta had written around the failure of sorts or the abdication of the Supreme Court to be able to uphold basic civic freedoms and liberties, and a trend, something that tends to have started in a more, I would say, wider explicit terms of sorts with what happened with the unionization of Jammu and Kashmir, and then number of instances since then. How do you see this change in the way the courts are functioning? And I know that the Supreme Court is often seen as to be having that larger amount of attention. There's less discussion about trial courts, the role of high courts, and where a lot of the times decisions regarding matters of bail to almost everything else is made. Criminal justice system works a lot on what happens like at the lower mode level. But if you could come in and also add to the discussion that we were having, and we'll then have Professor Ambreen and Sweta talking about their perspectives. Great, thanks.
Thank you very much, Dipanshu. And you have asked a direct question about the Supreme Court of India, which I will start with. And I think though your question is focused on a specific institution in a specific context, I think that it is related to the background, political discussions on, and also I think theoretical reflections on our time as to what's happening across the world in this polarized political landscape. So I think that first, in the case of the Indian Supreme Court, I don't think that the court has really changed in the way that it works. So we are appalled by the way that the court has not been able to protect the rights of Muslims in the Delhi riots, and has not been active in protecting the rights of the protesters in the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act demonstrations. But I think that broadly this pretty much is the same trajectory in which the court has been functioning since the 1970s. And the reason is that one has to take a second order look. One has to step back and see that what did powerful governments want at any given point of time, and did the court actually go against what the government wanted? And I would say that right now the court hasn't gone against what the government wanted, pretty much playing by the script. But also in the 1970s to the 90s, when we had 2 very interesting phases. One was the emergency, and the other was the court's resurrection through the public interest litigation, kind of jurisdiction, where the court really expanded social rights and, assumed jurisdictions of proportions which were never seen anywhere, where legal scholars across the world concluded that the Indian Supreme Court is one of the strongest courts in the world. But I think that if you take a critical look, during the emergency, the court did not stand up. Individual judges did stand up and they had to suffer. They were superseded, right? So that as an institution, the court was not able to deliver. During the public interest litigation, period of the court, there was pretty much a government which believed in a welfare state. And there was not much government opposition to the expanding of jurisdiction and to the recognition of social rights. Rather, at that point of time, the discussion was that when the government wouldn't want to do anything, they would ask the court to do it, right? And they would, not only political hot potatoes, which came much later, maybe late 90s and 2000s after liberalization, but before that, there was pretty much a synergy between the ideology of the states and the ideology of the court. So, holding big industries responsible, the right to education, which came much later, but right to life with human dignity, which meant rights of prisoners, rights against torture, other social rights, which the court pronounced, right to health, right to water, right to livelihood. Governments were not against these rights because pretty much we had socialist governments and also populist governments even at that point of time. So I don't think that in the larger framework, the court has, acted in a way which seems to be moving away from what it has always done. But I would say that it has moved away of what we expect out of courts. But amongst all of this, the court had this comfort at the time of the public interest litigation that the ideologies that were governing the court at that time went well with questions of protection of civil liberties, with questions of protection of rights, and governments did not deny them in at least publicly. We know that governments have been brutal even earlier, but they did not deny them publicly. So in that sense, I'm not surprised that the court is towing the line of the government. The Indian Supreme Court has rarely, if ever, stood up against strong governments. But to come to the context of the discussion today, the larger question which you raised, and I found it very interesting, which is the question of a political landscape. And I was pressed to think that what is this political landscape and where social justice is a concern today? And it seems to me that this polarized political landscape, at least in the case of India, the United Kingdom, the United States, and in Eastern Europe, has some common ingredients. One of those is polarization by representative electoral democracy. And in plural societies, if you have homogeneous societies where there are, where minorities are fewer, let's say negligible, that they don't electorally matter, then we don't see this polarization because the question of polarizing does not yield any electoral benefits. But in the case of India, US, the UK, and in Eastern Europe, where right-wing parties have even captured power, just like in India. You see that there is a dangerous mix of what representative electoral democracy can do in plural societies in an age where you have technology that allows for individuated propaganda, which can reach your bedrooms and tell you and appeal to your basest emotions and convert them into political ideology. And I think this kind of noxious political landscape makes us think about the potential of democracy, representative electoral democracy alone, as our savior in these times. And that, I think, is a major question which is staring at us today, and which doesn't arise in the case of China and Hong Kong. Though Hong Kong had a representative democratic system, we still know that it was a different kind of democratic system where you did have sectoral representation, and now you have a one country, two systems kind of clash, which makes Hong Kong a bit different from what's happening in the rest of the world. But the idea of suppression of democratic rights, of course, is common. And I think that in this kind of a polarized political landscape, social justice is a necessary casualty. So incentivized representative electoral democracy cannot work without denying social justice to certain sections of the population. And I think this is pretty much a jargonized way of saying what Professor Davis had said, in the sense that you need minorities in order for electoral representative, pathological representative electoral democracies to survive. And there, I would like to say something which is considered distasteful in political philosophy, that perhaps Plato had got it right when he said that all you need in representative democracy is the skill to win votes. That is what is at the larger analysis of things, what is important. The questions of human rights, questions of rule of law, questions of constitutionalism are not a necessary ingredient of representative democracy. And you can see this kind of a skeptical view about representative democracies of certain kinds, coming across the world. And I don't think that it is unhealthy. I think it is healthy because it makes us think more seriously about other claims of legitimacy to govern, which is related to transparency, accountability, and justification for the use of force. And in that, and Dipanshu had told us that perhaps we should stick to the points that we want for discussion. And if we come to the Indian context, I think that the Indian context in this background counts as something which can be called an immature institutional context, which is that our institutions are unable to resolve these political differences for us. That is because they are immature institutions. And in what sense are they immature? And I think they are immature in the classical sense, in the sense that when Weber, in the case of legal theory, H.L.A. Hart, in sociology, Nicholas Luhmann, when they were speaking of modernity, they were talking about systems that were independent and autonomous, which governed themselves through their own rules without any reference to background things such as a comprehensive moral view of the world, religion, or ideology even, and the ability of modern states to have these kind of bureaucratic independent systems and for them to function independently of background cultural reasons, I think was a hallmark of modern systems. And I say that certain countries perhaps are more mature, where they have strict separations of powers, where there is still some hope that you can fight majoritarian politics institutionally. But India is not that context. India is not that context because most of our institutions, whether you want to see the executive, the police, including the police, our election commission, our environmental bodies, all of them, none of them actually have immunity from political actors in any strong sense, including the court. Even though the court says that, the court is independent in the sense that only judges appoint judges, we know that the kind of importance that intelligence reports and the, let's say the approval of the Home Ministry plays in, appointment of judges, and which has come out openly in the media in the past, 6 or 7 years. So I think that India is an immature institutional context because we do not have independence and autonomous institutions which can check coercive use of power. And in this, I think that if you draw it on, paint it on a, broader canvas, it seems that we have on the one hand, electoral democracy giving legitimacy to majoritarian politics. That majoritarian politics is operating through immature institutions, which means that, and in the case of India, the coercive force of the state cannot be checked by institutions because none of the institutions are immune from state coercion. Ultimately, if you take it that these institutions are operated by individuals, and if you have a brutal, coercive, colonial police force, a Central Bureau of Investigation, and Enforcement Directorate, which are completely under the control of the executive, you are not nobody is immune from any kind of threat of coercion. And I think that when there is brutal, coercive power of the state against institutions which represent constitutionalism, constitutionalism always loses because you are reaching out to individuals and suppressing the very actors who make constitutionalism possible. So all this, I think, paints a very bleak picture. But but what is the way ahead? And I would like to conclude with that in what way can we think of how social justice has been impacted in India, and the second is how how can we deal with this problem of majoritarian politics and victimization of minorities in an immature institutional context like India. So for institutions, I think we have to work with a very narrow idea of justice, which is that institutions should stick to what is known as conservative justice, which is the idea that the received wisdom that we already have through our political traditions, we try and preserve them and not look at ideal justice, which is the new transformative project. I think that is, in the Indian context, it is something which is dangerous. This idea of transformative constitutionalism, it has really, has become very popular amongst constitutional theorists, but it also, constitutionalism necessarily is not transformative. Constitutionalism tries to protect the constitutional ideals which you have. You may have a transformative constitution like India has, but you cannot have transformative constitutionalism, right? So in that sense, I think, our institutions have to be conservative in terms of sticking to the rules. That is where our courts have failed. Bail is the norm, but bail is not given to, a pregnant woman we just saw, who is being accused of sedition for participating in a protest, right? The court is not intervening in giving directives to the executive when there is clear evidence before the police that hate speech has been made. And the Indian court, there is enough precedent where the court has actually directed, right? So in such cases, I think, just sticking to conservative justice, sticking to precedents would have helped the court, but the court went out of its way to please the government. The second point, and Dipanshu, I'll conclude with that, I think I've run out of time, is that in the case of India, because our institutions are not immune from the background, cultural, religious, moral, ideological pressures, I think that majoritarian politics can be countered if we take the discourse away from where majoritarian politics thrives, which is pan-Indian discourse. If it is the Hindi, North Indian majoritarianism, right? If that is the kind of majoritarianism, the present BJP government, thrives on, then the way to counter it politically is to take the discourse away of social justice away from that pan-Indian discourse, which is to go back perhaps to your linguistic, background culture, your ethnic background culture, and your, geographical background culture, and raise the question of social justice in those units. And when you talk about the pan-Indian identity, then the lowest common denominator is the Hindutva numbers, which is necessarily going to win in our electoral democracy. So I think the time to retreat and the time for pluralism to go back, people to go home and have questions of social justice in those decentralized forms is what is going to help us. This doesn't mean that, we all break away from each other. In this age of technology, we stay together, but the discourse must be localized. Otherwise, at least in India, I think there's a bleak future or a long haul fight against majoritarianism on our hands. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Preetham. And I think that was a fascinating set of, I was just taking my notes in the middle, but I just got reminded of these two, when I was reading Partha Chatterjee's political lineages in society, and the emphasis that you make on the need to decentralize and understand and look at what he talks about, the idea of nationalism as a very linguistic, cultural fragment, as a very unique feature of the South Asian fabric or social fabric. A point that I think we touch upon, let's say in the next week's panel, is a very interesting take. And I was particularly intrigued by these two aspects of your discussion around the case of polarization happening by representative electoral democracies, the nature of that. And that's interesting. That's true that there are a lot of electoral democracies that are seeing that behavior happening. Is that a result? I'm investigating that more from the economic angle as a part of some research that I'm doing, and I see there is evidence there. But this element on looking at immature institutional context and at immature institutions, I think that is a fascinating line of inquiry, particularly by looking at both not the legislative but also the executive functioning. We've seen right now, in response to even the pandemic, the failure of the executive to be able to implement basic legislations or a lockdown, let's say, right? And I think that points to this angle of immaturity. I want to bring in Professor Ambreen and Professor Sweta here, primarily because I think it's very element that one of the basic understandings of the recent set of mass, I would say, protests and movements, particularly in the last few years, have seen a tremendously large participation of women. And this has been true not only in the case of India, but across the board. We've seen that with the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, one of the founders of the movement itself happens to be a woman, and I think a few others who I was listening to. So I want to get a perspective here from Ambreen and Sweta on how they look at this concept and idea of social justice from a different perspective. And then we'll have Mr. Singh coming in, because I know Mr. Singh has been talking about the entire context of what's been happening in the Caribbean. But just to connect the dots right from Professor Davis to almost what's coming out, it would be interesting to get these views and then get Mr. Singh's views. All right. Just on the time, I would say around 12 minutes to 15 minutes, please. Professor Ambreen, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'll be speaking on the quest for gendered idea of justice. And this will primarily be from an Islamic paradigm. And I'll be looking at women and those who identify themselves as women. And why do I take an Islamic paradigm? It is because religion as a social institution has played a very instrumental, a very fundamental role in upholding patriarchal structures, in its construction of gender, and in its conceptualization of gender roles, gender relations, and also discriminatory ideas of justice and equality. So at this point in history, what we see is that patriarchy is ubiquitous, from state institutions to religious and social norms. The role of here, it's important to look at the role of Muslim feminists. And this role of Muslim feminists becomes increasingly important because these feminist scholars of Islam have been engaging for a long time now in both progressive and radical rereading of the Islamic texts, which are basically the sources of Islamic law, the Sharia. And this is being done to redefine and reformulate the gendered idea of justice. However, we see that in this endeavor of giving an endogenous viewpoint, which is a contextual rights-based reading to further the inclusive idea of justice, the Muslim feminists, both men and women, have been confronted from external and internal forces at multiple levels. And this also includes tension among Muslim feminists among themselves, which is, I believe, reconciliatory because these differences emerge over methodological differences. And if you look at the external and the internal challenges that Muslim feminists face, the first challenge comes to them from the state and its institutions that has always promulgated laws, religious laws, in the form of personal and family laws that were discriminatory to women in nature. And apart from the state, we also have the male clerical elite, and they play a very important role here. And this is the second challenge that comes to these Muslim feminists. And we see that the male clerical class has for centuries dominated the religious space. And in dominating this religious space, they have also monopolized the interpretation of the Quran, and which is of course androcentric in nature. And while these two forces exist as major challenges to Muslim feminists, what is very dangerous, what is concerning to us is the collusion between the two, the collusion between the state and the male clerical elite, wherein the state has not only upheld and reinforced patriarchal structures, but has also given legitimacy to the rigidity of Islamic thought and practices like veiling, seclusion, and tightly controlled marriage patterns, so on and so forth. So what we see that the consolidation of power at the level of the state and the codification of laws at the level of religious patriarchs has been a mutually benefiting exercise. This is true for all societies, including Muslim societies. And in fact, if we see in the Indian context or the Indian colonial history, the very formulation of personal laws, both Hindu and Muslim, was a result of this collusion. So the British colonialists concentrated on codifying Hindu and Islamic laws, drawing from, of course, scriptures, and then administering them in the courts. And this administration in the courts happened with the help of the Pandits and the Maulvis. So this codification also was a larger process, a process that involved selection of verses, that involved appropriation and reinvention of scriptures. These scriptures were varied and were often contradictory. So there are several verses in the Quran that contradict one another. And this contradictory element in the traditional scriptures was left open to the mercy of the interpreter being the male cleric, and who imprinted their interest while formulating the laws. So the personal laws became the bedrock of patriarchy. That was, of course, not gender sensitive. And apart from these two external and internal forces posing a challenge to Muslim feminists, we also have challenges being posed by secular feminists. And the fourth challenge that Islamic feminists confront is from this set of people, the secular feminists, who argue that Islam and feminism are incompatible to bring out any gendered idea of justice. So they claim that feminism is an exclusively Western concept. And in doing so, the secularists regard Islamic feminism as an oxymoron. So you have scholars like Hamid Shahidan, he's an Iranian secular feminist, and he painted Islamic feminism as something of a deepening identity crisis among women. So there were others also like Scheherazade Mujab, who argued that the real change, if we have to bring real change, if we have to bring democratization in Islamic law, it has to come from the outside of the religious framework. So however, this dismissal of a liberating and an emancipatory element that has been found within the Islamic tradition is seen by Islamic feminists like Margaret Badran, like Kesia Ali, as signs of ignorance. The dismissal is seen as a sign of ignorance, A, and B, it is also seen as a tool to delegitimize any kind of indigenous feminism. So they call for, so these Muslim Islamic feminists have called for a reading of history, and which demonstrates that feminism is neither an exclusively Western concept, nor it is a monolithic concept, because feminist movements and ideas have originated simultaneously in parts of the East and the West. So there are multiple expressions of feminism that have generated over time in diverse locations around the world. So if we take the example of Egypt, for instance, we see that Muslim women, along with their Christian female compatriots, embarked on an organized collective movement, women's rights and liberation. This was way back in 1920s. So it is the same time when feminism was gaining ground, was being used in the US, in Britain, in France, and also in British India. And a culmination of this was seen during the freedom struggle in the 1930s and 40s, which again was blown by, of course, the communalization of politics by the religious forces there, both Hindu and Muslim. So basically I want to say is that the Asian and the African women did not import feminism from the West. And in fact, they bridged a customary demarcation of gendered spaces that had emerged. Gendered spaces like the public for the men and the private exclusively confined space for women. And these women were not only building indigenous solidarities that we've seen, but were also as nationalist feminists countering Western colonialism. So what I'm trying to say is that instead of marginalizing the indigenous histories of resistance to patriarchy and gender injustices, we need to, in pursuit of a common goal of gender justice, reimagine our roles and build alliances and forge solidarities. Of course, what we've seen very recently in Shaheen Bagh is a site of protest, how solidarities have been forged. Now the entire challenge is to maintain that solidarity in the face of a very communalized state today. So of course, from a very post-colonial lens, women do not exist as homogeneous groups, and they have their segmented identities like class, like caste, community, race, and so on. However, in this larger goal of establishing a just and equal society, I have a question which maybe we can deliberate later after this. Can these segmented identities be subsumed in building a collective feminist front that transcends class, caste, and racial differences? So while Muslim feminists are engaged in both progressive and radical rereading of the text, it is important to reimagine the role of other players, primarily the secularists. And first is to bridge the dichotomy between the East and the West that has been there for long, even in academia. And second, of converging the secular and the religionists. And how would this happen? This would again happen by building alliances through interchange of dialogue between feminist mujtahids, who are the jurists, who are involved in bringing out a feminist code of Islamic law, and the modernists. So in this quest of gender justice, I would say that a collective voice that transcends all sectarian differences is basically the need of the hour. And I close here and request my friend and colleague to continue the conversation on this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In the meantime that Sweta is talking, Amreen, could you just mention the names that you talked about in the chat box? Because that's very interesting for the audience to be able to familiarize themselves with the kind of works that are happening in the field. Thank you.
Do that.
Sweta, please proceed. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So, at first I wanted to talk about the role of gender in today's justice movement, but after hearing the panel discussion, I think I'm going to translate this a little bit to the left, and I'm going to talk about institution. So, a lot of panelists, most of them have talked about institution. So, I'm going to talk about, and we are sort of enamored with this idea of justice, which is related to the idea of institution. So if we look at institution from another perspective, from a gender perspective, what should it look like? So I'm going to go on about that. So like Panshu said, that 3 Black women established the BLM movement. And in the last month, hundreds of BLM supporters walked across the US to take part in protesting George Floyd's death. But we did not hear much about Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was a Black emergency medical worker who was killed in her own home, in her own bed, 2 weeks before George Floyd. And in an effort to resurface Taylor's story on social media, feminist started using the hashtag Say Her Name. But after some time, that hashtag was turned into Say His Name. So Andre Ritchie, who is a lesbian Black activist who wrote an amazing book on Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women, she said that we are not trying to compete with Floyd's story, we are trying to complete the story. Still, Taylor's case remains disconnected from the broader international conversation that's happening around George Floyd, or BLM for that matter. Her exclusion and that of other Black women is the latest iteration of a long-standing issue. Black women's experience of injustice and their contribution to mass justice movement. So this makes us stop and ask the question, what role gender actually play? And when I say gender, I'm talking about females, and I'm talking about cis and trans women as well, in the multiple justice movements that are emerging. and what is how it is changing the idea of violence, injustice, and justice in a different way. So first, I think feminist idea is actually making feminist like resurgence of emergence of social movements are making us think differently about where we look for the victims of state violence. So, and I'm borrowing from Kathy Cohen, who is a Black feminist scholar and activist from Chicago. She says that there is a traditional and normative model of who we think as victims. It's usually a male who is fighting against the system, fighting against the police. We are not looking at justice, we are looking at injustice in a very genderless way. But when we are thinking about violence, we have to think about women. We cannot put women in the same category as men. For example, domestic violence laws. If you take the work of someone like Beth Ritchie, who is an exceptional Black feminist scholar, and she focuses on the issues of reincarceration and the violence against women. And she has written that when most think about violence against women, the traditional response in the mainstream domestic violence movement has been to involve the state, involve the institution, involve the police. But we do not see the fact that in most of the time, this police and the state are the one who are the oppressor in many communities of color and in poor communities. So when we are bringing women back in the conversation, we have to understand what role the institution plays. That the institution is pitted against women. So, and this brings me to my second contribution of feminism to the justice movement. Feminism is actually informing the BLM movement in terms of its leadership. It is breaking the stereotype of a single charismatic male leader. Now we are seeing a lot of female leaders coming up who are young, who are queer, or at least they promote the idea of queerness. And this affects that demand that the organizations are putting forth. For example, Say My Name, one of the demands was, of course, defund the police, right? BLM movement. But another demand was adopt and enforce police department policies banning officers from searching people to assign gender based on anatomical features. Second, require officers to respect gender identity and expression in all police interactions, searches, and placement in police custody. Third, create spaces to discuss how patriarchy, homophobia, and transphobia are impacting the communities as a whole. So the idea of justice with inclusion of this female gaze or this gender gaze is being expansive now. We are expanding it. We are thinking broadly and radically about what we are fighting for. And we are fighting against the institution in itself. So the outcome, what we want, is actually going against the institution. We are fighting for first recognition, second representation, and third the redistribution of material resources or any other socioeconomic resources. So the gendered idea of justice is actually, I think, in my opinion, is looking at institution is completely in favor of dismantling the current institution. So if we think about justice, we cannot have it in the traditional way. We cannot involve the police. We cannot involve the Supreme Court. We cannot involve the bureaucrats. We have to, the policy, it has to start from immediate policy changes, but at the end of the day, we have to have a structural transformation. And I think feminism is decentering this masculine public space. And it is actually challenging this power-laden discourse. And at the same time, it is looking at how gendered the normal or traditional institutions are and how we can go beyond them. So yeah, that's
right. No, I think that's fascinating. Actually, this is interesting because when I was listening to Professor Davis, Professor Preetham, and Professor Vesselin, there was a very different framework that we were moving towards, basically, right? And there was a lot of focus around mixing these issues around recognition, representation, but focusing our, I think, angle more towards social movements for certain causes and then moving towards it. I get reminded often of this development economist, Professor Arjun Sen Gupta, who used to talk about the idea of human development and how everything we try to encompass seems to come into that space, whether it's human rights, whether it's advocacy for basic rights, economic well-being, social well-being, and sometimes that makes the discussion far too broad rather than, and I'll borrow quickly from Professor Preetham's point that the idea of focusing on a narrow framework of justice for institutions somewhere probably makes sense so that you have simplified understandings of what basically institutions seem to be capable of or mature are of, and then move towards that. Because it seems that societies after a point of time can handle as much as that of change that institutions can secure, right? And there are others that take their own time. I want to get Mr. Singh in here because he's going to come in with a very different perspective, and he's the final speaker for today's session. Just give us an idea on what's happening in the Caribbean, because just putting all of these perspectives together, could you share with what's happening there? And we'll then probably just open it up for panelists to comment on each other.
All right, thank you, everybody. Just confirm that you're hearing me clearly.
Yes, we are.
So first, you know, to the school, to CNES, you distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. Truth be told, I have learned a lot more from listening to you that I would leave you with. So forgive me for that injustice that I'm about to commit. I would like to begin my contribution by reflecting precisely on the theme of the discussion, and that is on the meaning of social justice in a polarized political landscape. You know, the term justice, as we know it today, has its contemporary roots in Old English term justice, which has among its many meanings the administration of justice and not merely the presence of rules and the law. So at the core of this discussion about social justice, therefore, is the social ramification of the administration of the law. It is in that context and that framework that I wish to situate my contribution. When I use the term the law seconds ago, what exactly am I referring to? Well, in large measure, I'm referring to the Rousseauian concept of the social contract and the sort of moral, legal, and political rules that we have collectively agreed upon. The Constitution and other legislation which set out our individual and collective rights, privileges, and freedom, therefore are at the center of the stage of this debate. More specifically, the administration of the provisions of the law by public institutions that are so empowered. And you would have heard from all the speakers in many, many instances in their deliberation, they have alluded to some aspect of this. Now, at this juncture, we can embark on a discussion on a substantive discussion on the ability, the capacity, the independence of such institutions to administer the law in a transparent, fair, and equitable manner. But I would caution that such a discussion would only likely to bear meaningful insight if we are to focus on periods of political, social, and economic stability. You see, changing political dynamics and periods of economic and social stress perhaps teaches us more about the administration of the law, since in this period, you're likely to have material impact and changes on how the law is administrated. In this regard, I want to focus on the issue of elections. and how it fits within this entire social justice project. Elections in this regard are particularly important since the decision on who controls the state and the institutions that are empowered to administer the law that governs our collective and individual behavior are precisely the choice that society makes during an election. And therein lies a fundamental challenge for this entire notion about social justice. You see, changes in political leadership tends to be associated with changes in the administration of the law, even if there is not material changes in the law itself. So the question then is, how can society ensure that such changes that we will see during the times of political transitions and political changes do not result in a backward or sort of sideways movements in how the law is administered, but move in a direction of improvement. We have to recognize, I think, that benevolent, democratic and progressive leadership cannot be guaranteed, even in democratic societies. The solution, therefore, I would argue, is that political leadership, the solution that I would point to is that institutional safeguards that we collectively put in place to ensure that changes in political leadership does not change the fundamental administration of justice, at least not in a regressive manner. What this requires of us is requires at least the majority of society to appreciate the following precepts. One is that injustice has no color, and two, it can take many forms. And while social injustice can and does change over time, what we have seen probably in the last century is that it has survived the test of time, and it cannot be left to the forces of market. It has to be deliberate outcomes and policy decisions that we take and we make to improve our social relationship and social outcomes. Now I'm going to provide an example that is unfortunately currently ongoing, and to some extent that Professor Dipanshu has alluded to earlier, which is the electoral and political crisis that is unfolding in Guyana that has engaged the entire Caribbean attention and even the major Western powers. And just a little bit of a background: on December the 21st, 2018, the government of Guyana, which is a parliamentary democracy system, fell to a motion of no confidence in the country's 65-seat parliament, just 3 years after being elected in office. Now, the Constitution requires elections every 90 days after the successful passage of such a motion. What happened since that motion passed is an outright refusal of the incumbent administration to concede defeat. And what it embarked on instead is to sought the intervention of the courts to exploit every possible loophole that there was inside of the law. And I can give you an example where we actually went through the entire judiciary from the lowest to the highest level to figure out whether 33 is a majority of 65. It was that ludicrous. Now, 349 days after the constitutional deadline has passed for when the elections, a new and fresh election should have happened, we finally got an election that was held on March the 2nd of this year. We are now almost 108 or 110 days, and we still have not had the results of that elections. So what we have seen throughout the entire period, like I mentioned before, is a concerted and consistent and a determined effort by a small group within society, those who have control over the state, to exploit every possible means to retain control of the state. And what complicated the issue even further is that we have public servants from the very agencies that were entrusted with the administration of the law that willingly participated and in some instances aided efforts by the incumbent to bend and break the rules, to undermine the will of the people and to remain in office. So it is perhaps worth reflecting on the purpose again of elections. In democracies, it is sort of the ultimate mechanism of accountability that the Constitution has placed squarely in the hands of citizens to hold their governments accountable. To escape such accountability would not only be to operate without consequence or even praise, but to undermine the fundamental rights, freedom, and privilege of citizens that are afforded to them by the rule of law. Now, the Guyanese society share a lot of commonality with developing countries around the world, regardless of which region they're located in. In our context, it is polarized along ethnic lines. In addition to dealing with the challenges, the sort of basket of challenges that define a developing country of poverty, inequality, underdevelopment, corruption, and these kinds of issues. But what became evident almost over the last 2 years since we had the incident of the no confidence motion in Parliament was a raw exposure of the cracks and the weaknesses in our social institutions. And I'm referring to both those that are of customary, that are tradition, those that are envisaged in our Constitution, even in legislation. And more importantly, the application of it. This exposure, in my belief, it presents an opportunity that we do not get in normal economic times. And that is for society to open an honest and a widespread, a sort of participatory discussion about these weaknesses in and of themselves, but more importantly, to collectively reform the rules, to ensure that the scales of injustice sort of tilt its way back to some form of equilibrium. To do any less, in my view, would be the greatest misfortune both for society and government and the future interaction of these agencies. In other words, the very survival of the notion of the social contract is what we have on the table here today with us across the globe. And what I would probably land here with is to say that maybe Douglas North and the writings of Amartya Sen has come to life in the past couple of years, perhaps the last 10 years, where the notion that market-based economies or Western-style democracies and the economic development that can come with these markets orientation and the arrangement, the social arrangement, they do not necessarily equate to human development. And Sen deliberated on this very, very thoroughly, that at the heart of the Human Development Project is not just about more access to goods and services, but access to fundamental rights, freedoms, and privileges. And so I think as we continue to have this discussion, we have to, as a society, within the pockets of our decentralized nodes, as Professor Pritam had mentioned, within those pockets, we have to define for ourselves and our society what we want the social project to be, and a fundamental re-questioning of whether the traditional notion of what the social project is and the arrangement that we have by rescinding our right to be governed to those who govern us, and the arrangements, the rules of that arrangement, whether that is a reflection of where the globe is in a globalized time, in the sort of the age of globalization, and whether or not it can sustain what lies ahead, probably the next 50 years or the next 100 years. And so I think we're going through a period of fundamental re-questioning, not just within the context of social justice as opposed to social injustice, but what this entire social project means for society, how we organize it, what the forms of government are, and what our expectations are in how the law should be administered. Sort of the thin line that I think I want to add to the debate here is, it's not just about the institutions that you have. It's not just about what they stand for. It is not just about the form and arrangement of the government that you have. It is even not only about what provisions are encapsulated in the laws of the land, but how we administer those is where acts of injustice takes place, is where why you are not held by the same account for the same crime that I might have committed. And it is that I want to leave the panel with, and I can take questions as we go on. But that I would rest there for my contribution.
All right, great. I mean, thank you. This was long and sweet, but there are a few questions which are there in the chat box, and what I'd request a couple of people to do is to be able to read them, and in the meantime, I'll ask Professor Davis to respond to what has been said after him, and just any thoughts that he would probably want to share with us. But just before I do that, I'll ask Professor Ambreen, Mr. Singh, and Professor Preetham to be able to view the chat box and look at some of the comments. There's some brilliant interjections offered from Mr. Gibran and a few others. What I'd request everyone to do is, all the participants, is this is the time that you put your questions in the chat box, and we'll then have those. We have around 25 minutes of time. So I think we have enough time to be able to respond to each of the comments. So Professor Davis, just to hear on what you have observed in this, I know a lot of voices have come in, but this is the objective for these particular sessions. When we resume classes back on campus, we'll be doing smaller, more focused deliberations. But the idea of these sessions is to get as many voices as possible to address on a theme. Thank you. If you could respond.
Thank you. Am I heard? I hope so. The thing I find interesting, I guess, about all of this, and Preetham's comments were helpful for me. I'm a professor, as he is, of constitutional law, and I always see constitutionalism as a kind of conversation. It's basically a big discussion. And as Guyana mentioned, sometimes in ordinary times institutions work, and the conversation is interinstitutional and via institutions. And then, as Bruce Ackerman liked to say in his long series of books on We the People, that sometimes we the people have to speak. And this is where the conversation of constitutionalism and social justice converge, you know. And so when we the people speak, sometimes we find that we're listened to, and everyone's included, whether it be over gender or ethnic groups or indigenous groups. How we bring all these people to the conversation is the challenge of our time, because we live in such a diverse world where we all migrate back and forth across our own countries and across the globe, so that the diversity is a kind of defining characteristic. Certainly in countries like my own, the United States and India, those are probably the most prominent characteristics, the diversity. And so how do you include people in a safe and healthy way? And that's an institutional challenge. But I think sometimes when we teach constitutional law and constitutionalism, we get so focused on the institutions that we fail to appreciate sufficiently that sometimes the institutions are not enough, that it's we the people on the street that are speaking as well. And then this recent episode of a protest in the United States and Hong Kong, where police violence was such a prominent feature, then starts to take shape. And we start asking, well, there's one particular institution, the executive branch in part, and its enforcement arm, what is it doing? So all of that's on the table. And then along also comes this big global conversation of authoritarianism versus democracy. And in a country like India, you even, and mine, I mean, we both have leaders that are authoritarian minded in their own approach. And so the conversation about how to constrain that, how to respond to things Vesselin raised about populism and right-wing populism in particular, which is what we've been seeing recently with Donald Trump and Modi and Duterte and others. So how do we respond to that? I think it's engaging us all, and we're trying to get there with less violence, I suppose, with peaceful means where we hope we speak and everyone listens, but it's not always the case. And I think that has been the challenge we face now. It's interesting, when I got up this morning, the National Public Radio was on, as I hear it every morning, and a woman was on there in the Black Lives Matters protest, celebrating the idea that, oh, there's a rainbow of people out here supporting our protest. So it's not just the African-American people protesting against white abuse, though the white Americans are also out there protesting to support the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think that inclusiveness is probably the way out of the dilemma of how to get a collective society that we appreciate. So that's sort of a broad, sweeping kind of response to all these diverse.
Yeah. So we have. Yeah, please.
One more thing, and that's just on the question of violence. Specific point that Vesselin made. Violence in protest is not just the looting. It's also responding to police abuse. It's throwing rocks. It's vandalizing government offices or burning down Communist Party headquarters. So we can't separate the violence totally from the protest. So we do have to deal with that and make our judgment about how we respond to violence in our movement. It's not just the criminals, the looting guys, but in these protests that we're seeing now, it's not so much looting at all. It's mostly just anger and violence in response to police power.
Great. I hope everyone has been able to view their questions, because there were a number of questions coming in. I'll probably start with Professor Preetham and then Mr. Singh, and then go backwards like that. There are a few questions. I don't know if Preetham, have you been able to? There's one question from Gibran and a few others
yes.
by Ankit. Please.
So the way I have seen is that there is a question by Professor Ambreen, and then there's one by Gibran which has just come. So shall I just quickly go in that order, or?
Yeah, that's fine. Many orders fine.
Yeah. So Professor Ambreen asked me, is that in what sense did I say that the court is as compromised today as it was earlier, and in what sense was it as communalized? So I just want to, perhaps I didn't make myself clear. I wasn't saying that the court was compromised in any personal sense of the term. Rather, I was trying to say that what did the court as an institution do now, and what did the court as an institution do earlier? And my claim was that in terms of standing up to governments who had ideologies which opposed what ordinarily we would think our constitution, mandates, I don't think there has been a major shift in that. The court has always gone along with what the state of India generally as an ideology has. So it might be coincidental. Right now, I don't think it's coincidental, because it's a question of coercion, which has come out very clearly. But the general trend has been that institutions such as courts, which are not strongly immunized, may not be able to stand up to coercive authoritarian powers. And our hopes, therefore, sometime, I think, should be limited. And I think this might also be the case in Hong Kong. If there are no other avenues for, the constitutional courts in Hong Kong, the High Court in Hong Kong, to, adjudicate cases that might come, towards them. So in India too, there might not be any escape for the judges, if, from a brutal authoritarian government. And so, and I think that has not changed much. So I was not saying that they're compromised. In today's case, I think this word compromise is important, because questions have been raised about how judges have been appointed. In the case of judges of the Supreme Court who have, superseded several others. Judges of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of India, against whom allegations have been made that he favored certain judges who were related to him or who had worked with him. This came out in the Caravan magazine. So I think that the levels of compromising in terms of personal compromise, the allegations are much higher today, though nothing is proven, but there is a lot to be spoken of, which I don't think existed at an earlier point of time to this extent. In the case of communalized, I would say that the entire country is more communalized today than it was before, so courts are no exception. So in that sense also, perhaps I would stand corrected that in these two senses, the court has changed. Now, there was another question, which is, I think, Gibran's question, which is, comes towards the end, and if I can, it just came about, so so I get temptation to, let me just read it for a moment. I want to yes.
And may I also request, because there are a couple of questions for Professor Vesselin and a couple of questions from Mr. Singh. You could just view this in the chat box, because I'm avoiding reading it out so that we don't miss out anything. Please review the chat box, and we'll then take the final comments from each one of you.
Okay, so to Gibran's question, so yes, Gibran has pointed out that the constitutional morality, the question of building constitutional morality is not just up to the courts now, it is outside on the streets, and I think Professor Davis just touched upon that. I think Professor Ambreen, Professor Sen, all of them, everyone said that the idea is now to develop a kind of culture which is outside, right? And I think that is important. But the real challenge is as to what would that culture be? Because the problem in India is that this idea of constitutional morality, which our court has articulated in terms of, and I don't think it's absolutely correct to say that, but Justice Chandrachud said the founding faith of the Constitution are equality, liberty, and dignity. I'm curious why he left out social and economic justice or republicanism. These are all there in the, or fraternity. They are all there in the preamble, but one would say, yes, these are good values. So on this basis, morality should be built. But the challenge outside is that how do we build a constitutional morality when a large part of the electorate does not seem to view another section of their, of the citizenry as equals? And in that, the question then, I think there is a role for institutions also to play, because sometimes when there are no adjudicators or mediators in social spaces, we do try and look at institutions which have some amount of neutrality, which is always, the degrees always vary, independence and expertise to tell us what these moralities are. And I think that in that sense, courts can still matter. But it is not my view that constitutional morality is the preserve of the institutions. Rather, in the case of India, I forgot to mention this, even though we have immature institutions, we have a mature constitutional culture, which we got out of our independence movement. And that way of building a constitutional morality is not an institutional one. It is a background culture one, where we retreat out of institutions to build a background culture. And that political culture, I think we can look back to our independence movement of how to build that. So I think that should take center stage now rather than institutions. Yes.
All right. Mr. Singh, would you like to involve, because there was this one question on Guyana particularly, and so I don't want that to be missed out. I can read it out for you if you want. The question is from, I don't know who's the person, but the question is basically, how will the current impasse in the elections results in Guyana and the recent constitutional crisis influence the increased need for social justice in Guyana? In other words, basically putting it all together, whatever discussion we're having, how do you situate this? Because I think culturally and ethnically, you have two groups, right? The Indo-Guyanese and the Afro-Guyanese, and there has been this discussion around that for how much or how long you can ensure a harmonious conduct between two very different ethnic societies. So just do that. And then Professor Popovski, please. Yeah.
To directly respond to how this might get resolved, I have to say that, just to quickly piggyback on something that I've said earlier, that one of the cracks that we have seen with the whole crisis was that even though the Elections Commission is a constitutionally independent commission, that did not in and of itself prevented the kinds of executive influence and penetration because of something that Professor Preeta mentioned just now. Again, the appointment of the leadership of these institutions. The good thing that I think is working for us is that the court did ultimately hold the line, that although there was sustained systemic efforts to sort of overturn an election on technicality, on legal technicality, the courts did, at the time when it was called upon, apply what is called the purposive construction of interpreting the Constitution. So even though you might have words that says X and Y and you want to expose, sort of stress their weaknesses, the court said, look, this was not the intent of Parliament. It was not the intent of the Constitution to have an election overturned on technicality. So like I said, we're still going through the final case will be heard today at 10 o'clock. So overall, I think those who have tried to sort of subvert the election have not succeeded, precisely because every time it came to the court, it did ultimately hold the line. But the other part of the question which I want to respond to, and again, within the whole broad context of what all the other panelists are saying, when I talk about us rethinking this power arrangement and the administration of the rules, we cannot have this discussion without bringing in another term that is often used about shared governance and what it means. You see, we have always think about the state, the three arms of the state, and we have entrusted the executive with the administration of justice. We have the courts and the judiciary saying, okay, we will hold the line to make sure that this is done within the confines of the law. But then at the same time, we allow the executive to be the one to appoint those who have to administer and oversee the administration of the law in the judiciary. So maybe one of the things that we want to rethink as a society at this time is, should we then be electing the judges who sit on court? So we make that decision as we the people, and not put that in the hands of the executive, where politics tend to it tends to get into the influence of these things. So I'm going to wrap up this by saying that, again, my emphasis here is always on the practicality and the implementation of the arrangements that we come to. We can have the best arrangement. We can have the principles envisaged in the preambles or even in explicit provisions of the law. But unless and until we have a very transparent and accountable way of administering it, in that administration is, in my humble belief, where the injustice tends to happen. And so that is something that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah. Professor Amreen, I think you wanted to come in, please. I don't want to, yeah, go ahead, please.
So I want to respond to Gibran's question.
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
agree with him when he says that basically that the majoritarian government, in this case the BJP for now, appropriates women's rights movements. And I wanted to bring this point, of course, there, but because of time limitation. And this is also one of the dangers that Muslim feminists face, and which is their causes are appropriated by. But why is the right wing able to appropriate feminist causes? We also need to look into that. And if you go into the history, and in fact, India as a post-colonial state is an inheritor of coloniality of power, and which is very visible in across India today, we see. And we started with in history with white women's burden. So white women's burden to come out as saviors of Indian women. And similarly, the same trope is being used by this majoritarian government to emerge as a savior of Muslim women. But actually, is something substantive happening to change the social condition of these women? I completely agree with you, and just adding to what you wanted to know. That's all.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are fascinating interjections, because the recent arrests of women social activists, Devangna Kalita and Natasha Narwal, Sudha Bharadwaj, I don't know if a lot of people know, but these are just outrageous. And it's interesting that in the last few months, and the way kind of I've been understanding, particularly this started amplifying with the lockdown situation, a lot of arrests were made of those who were peacefully protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And a lot of them seems to be, and somebody needs to do a small study on this, on how many women have been arrested across the board, whether it was the violence in Jamia, JNU, and a number of instances. So there definitely seems to be this understanding that the state is particularly coming hard against women social activists. Not that others are not getting into the line, but maybe they're not getting the kind of attention, but I think it's interesting to look at that as a facet. I want to get the final thoughts from Professor Vesselin and Professor Sweta, just if there's something that needs to be said. But Professor Vesselin had a few questions given, yes, and we will then close. Yeah.
Thank you, Dipanshu. Yes, there was a question about the Britishness and the statutes. And what I must say is that, kind of linking that to the type of a discussion we had about violence during protests. Well, I will say there is a justified violence and there is non-justified violence. And let me give you a clear example. The removal of the Statute of Colston in Bristol is 100% justified violence. There is absolutely no need of that statute. This is a person who is not even controversial. He never did anything good in his life. He's personally involved in the killing of 30,000 people in Africa. And actually, the statute is not a result of some sort of respect for the history even. He paid himself for that statute. The money on the blood of the Africans he collected, he gave to the mayor of Bristol to put that statute. So it should have been removed 40, 50 years ago. Somehow some statutes have too comfortable life for too long. And again, when I make that argument, a lot of people say, but do it legally. Make a petition. Ask the mayors to kind of try to make a lobby. No way. We in Eastern Europe didn't put any petition. We will send somebody nighttime to remove that statute and that's it. So that's 100% justified. But I agree that some violence, looting a shop and stealing a jewelry, is 100% non-justified. So that's on the statute. But let me say something else. When we talk about law and order, of course, the law and order, somehow the protests are against the law and order. It's absolutely the opposite. The protesters are in favor of law and order. The black people in America demand the police to follow the law and order. The police is violating, the state is violating the law and order. So restoring law and order is exactly what the protesters want, not the other way around. But also there is a problem with the silent majority. See, if the minority protests and the majority is silent, it doesn't work. So for example, if Muslims protest in India, but the Hindi are silent, it doesn't work. You need the majority to join the minority in the protests and in the change. Until the white Americans do not join the black Americans, until the Hindi don't join the Muslim in India, until men do not join the women for the women's right, it will not work. So we need that kind of crossing and forget kind of silence, tranquility, and conformism, because that's not law and order, it's the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vesselin. Professor Sweta, any final thoughts? We need to probably close in a few minutes, but just anything that needs to be said?
I'm still grappling with the practical idea of justice. Panelists are proposing that the institutions need to be changed, but to what extent? The thing is, we have started seeing change of institution in terms of defunding the police movement, the police, and like bringing community members in. The idea of justice is changing, but what I think is we have a lot of questions but very few answers. What does it look like in practice? So yeah, that was my final thought.
No, as just to conclude and give the final, probably just, concluding statement, as I started off, and this is something, and I think it should be out in a day or two. As I said, that I've personally found a lot of insights in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. And I know it is not generally something that tends to be looked upon, because jurists or a lot of other scholars have a tendency where I've seen that there's a lot of focus on rules-based order and institutional ideas of looking at the concept of social justice and how it can be delivered. But Smith's perspective was a lot on social psychology and using and understanding social psychology, a point that I think Professor Preetham was touching upon, that you need to go back a little bit, not to disengage, be connected, but at the same time start looking at a lot of questions from what you would consider as a local perspective. That was very essential to Adam Smith's proposal in Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I would probably urge a few of the participants to look a little bit at how the concept of nyaya, even that Professor Sen was talking about in the idea of justice, largely was trying to, and I know Professor Sen has been critiqued a lot for his own views, in the idea of justice, and there has been criticisms. But I think somewhere there was this understanding that in Adam Smith, reason alone cannot be seen as a grounding basis for understanding the meaning of social justice. And there needs to be an evolutionary process. I think Professor Vesselin's point on the toppling of statues and that becoming an act today, and as a necessary act of sorts, seems that there is a certain evolution of this social understanding of what is seen as a historical wrong and as a wrong today. Maybe finding its meaning in a wider masses today. Maybe it was there before as well, but today people are saying, well, no, this is something that is totally not done. And I would probably leave that with final thoughts here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming in. This was a long 2-hour discussion, but I thank each of the participants, a lot of the participants who stayed throughout the session. I thank Professor Davis, Mr. Singh for taking this time out in the US early in the morning, Professor Vesselin, Professor Preetham, Professor Ambri, and Professor Sweta. Thank you guys, and we'll stay connected for our next session next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Vidyut, are you here?
Hello, yes, sir.
Oh, thank you, Vidyut. Thank you so much. Thank you for your help and assistance. If the recording has been done, Vidyut, you could share with us. That would be lovely. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Vidyut. Yeah.